Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Neeta Aneja, and I'm the founder of Trends, which is the platform for art, cultural, social, and literary experiences. And with me is my co-host Shreya, who's a budding architect and a spoken word poetess. Sandeep, thanks a ton for getting us and Ananth together for this wonderful interaction. I'm extremely delighted to welcome everyone today for the special edition of our author interaction series. Today we have our 17th author interaction. In fact, in the last 3 months, we've already completed our 16th, and today we have our 17th. We are, in fact, indeed really honored to welcome Ananth. He's, in fact, an author, very, very renowned author and a very senior journalist, one of the very few stationed in China, and he's the China correspondent with the newspaper Hindu. He was earlier the China bureau chief for India Today. In 2019, in fact, he was a visiting fellow at Brookings India. In fact, his reporting in China has taken him to all the 33 provinces except 3. Anand's book, which has been launched earlier this month, India's China Challenge, A Journey Through China's Rise and What It Means for India, has been published by HarperCollins. It encompasses Anand's decade-long experience in China. In fact, he's one of the credible voices when it comes to reporting from within China. Being a journalist, in fact, has given Ananth a front row seat to China's remarkable rise and how its leading opinion makers view India. Anand's new book, India's China Challenge, comes at a very, very critical juncture. In fact, as India enters the 5th month of its border standoff with China along the line of actual control. Ananth, in fact, reported and traveled across China for over a decade, and his book explores 4 main challenges for India: the political challenge, the military challenge, the social challenge, the cultural challenge, and also the conceptual challenge of changing how Indians think. So not taking so much of time, let us find out much more from the man who's been in the news for the very, very right reasons. So welcome to our series, Ananth. What a privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Neeta. And it's my privilege early and a real pleasure to be with you this evening.
Ananth, I must say that it is rare to have a view of China from a knowledgeable Indian perspective, especially in these times of China backlash. You know, of course, COVID and of course, the boundary issues. So that is why we are so excited to have you with us, and congratulations on your new book. In fact, India's China Challenge, published by HarperCollins and available on Amazon, is a non-fiction book, which should be a manual to know China better. But before we get into it, let me begin by asking an alternative question, actually. You know, all of us are in this webinar because we want to understand what is happening, what is China's perspective, etc., etc. But do you think there is any exercise from China's part going on? Do you think they even care to understand our narratives and are perhaps equally eager to know us better?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think it's a parallel process where I think both countries are trying to have a better sense of the other. And I think that, frankly, just as we are often sometimes concerned about the lack of information that we get from China, which still is so closed in so many ways. Actually, I think that, as I mentioned in the book, in some sense, it's a mutual ignorance. I think when you look at misperceptions, it goes both ways. And I think that it's even harder in some sense in China because of the fact that, unlike in India, they don't have a free media. The media is entirely controlled by the Communist Party. So a lot of the information that they get is still in many ways mediated through this whole censorship mechanism that works in China. So you do get certain tropes about India that often negative tropes, unfortunately, that tend to be portrayed in the media in China. So as I say, I think it works both ways. But obviously, as an Indian, I'm more concerned about what we can do to understand the place better, to understand the China challenge better. And I think in many ways, we are better placed to do that, given that the big difference being that we do have a more open media and academic environment than China does. So theoretically, we're in a better position. But as I also lament in the book, I don't think we've done as well as we should have.
In fact, Ananth, what was the motivation for writing a book of this stature. I mean, of writing something which, I mean, I personally have not read such a comprehensive, such a beautiful book on China to understand even their perspective better. So what was your motivation on trying to write a book like this? You started writing before the recent incident that took place, and so what was it that made you realize you want to write and explore something like this, something on China, let people know in India all about China?
So I actually never really worked on this book when I was in China. So I was based there. I first went in 2008 and learned some Mandarin and moved to Beijing in 2009 as a reporter for The Hindu. I stayed with The Hindu in China till 2014, and then was very lucky to move to India today after that. And so I only moved back to India in August 2018. And so throughout this stint in China, I really didn't work on this book. And when I left China and moved back to India in August 2018, I kind of actually decided that I wouldn't write a book because I just felt that in some sense it was such an overwhelming experience that I think I learned so much, and I felt that in many ways there was no easy narrative. So I thought that writing a book would be very difficult because you need to have an argument, a very simple, easy argument. And I felt like in many ways China is a country like India where you can't do an India book because there's just so much. I mean, where would you begin and where would you end? So that was something I decided. But I think, as I also mentioned in the book, the longer that I was here, the more I felt that there is a story to be told, because I was encountering in daily conversation so much interest from people and curiosity from people. But I was also asked questions that kind of shocked me to my core in terms of how little people actually knew of what was happening, and in many ways how perceptions were quite outdated, and I felt didn't really capture the China that I lived in. So, but I should thank my editor at HarperCollins, Swati Chopra. She actually approached me to write a book, and she was the one that slowly worked on me and convinced me that you can do it. And I think she also brought me to a stage where I was comfortable in not having to force myself to have a narrative with a very clear argument, and to more have a reporter's book, which is more an observation of a reporter and not an academic or a scholar who has a case to make. So I think she really helped me shape it in a way and get over my big reluctance to write, and I should thank her for it. So most of this book was written in 2019, a year I spent as a visiting fellow at Brookings India, and then as a visiting fellow in Hong Kong University. So I do have a long chapter on Hong Kong, since I lived in Hong Kong right when the protests were happening in end of 2019. And I started writing the book in August 2020. So I really didn't have that much time to make sense of the boundary crisis. Though I did have about a month and a half to try and understand what led to the events, the terrible events in Galwan Valley. So I do devote a chapter to that in the book. But we can talk about that later in the Q&A. But while writing this book, I frankly didn't expect things to come to where they did this summer, which is, I think, a really unfortunate situation.
Exactly.
So very nice. I feel that Swati Chopra definitely played a very major role. I've been reading that how the book came up and everything. But did you really visualize the situation, aggravating while you were writing this book? I mean, could you see it? Could you feel a little bit happening here and there that, the situation will really, really go up like this, flare up like this?
I think that, so for me, the 2017 boundary crisis in Doklam, which I write about in the book as well, was something that I think really showed all of us that these things can happen. And at that point, I genuinely thought that it would be as bad as things got, because for 2 years, 2018 and 2019, both the Indian and Chinese governments really invested a lot to fix the relationship after this huge crisis in Doklam, which is why you had these two informal summits. You had Prime Minister Modi going to China in April 2018, to Wuhan of all places. And then you had President Xi Jinping coming to Chennai, Mamallapuram, in October 2019. So it seemed that both were on track, and even though there were all these problems that they hadn't solved, there seemed to be a meeting of minds that, listen, we can't get along in every sphere, but there are other problems we both are dealing with. India has domestic challenges that we have to face. The Chinese were preoccupied with this huge deterioration in ties with America and the trade war. So there seemed to be a meeting of minds up until end 2019, and then the pandemic hit, which is something that I think nobody saw coming. And funnily enough, I happened to be in Beijing for 3 weeks in January, right when the pandemic hit and China went into lockdown, which was quite something to witness, which we can talk about as well in terms of their response to the pandemic. But I think the pandemic changed many things. We still don't know why China did what it did along the line of actual control in May. I think we can speculate, and I try to refrain from speculating the reasons for why they made these huge mobilizations and transgressions. But I think that in many ways, the pandemic completely changed the equation. It asked very tough questions of the Chinese leadership in January and February about the mistakes they had made throughout December in Wuhan. And I think that in the months since, you have seen a lot of assertive behavior from China, not just vis-a-vis India, but with Taiwan and in the South China Sea and other theaters as well. So I don't know how much of this was because of this huge trauma and stress caused by this terrible Black Swan event, which I think is a question we may never know the answer to.
So do you think it was sort of like a compensation that China was trying to show that, we're still not behind and we're trying to maybe, is that why the incident happened? Do you think that could be the reason?
I think, Shreya, as I said, I'm always wary about giving a very definitive X, Y, or Z answer for what I think it could have been a combination of factors. But I do think that history has at least shown us that just looking at history as a guide, I think at moments where there have been a lot of internal pressures, I think that there have been occasions where they have acted out externally. And I think that it's not to say, I think it's too simplistic to say that, carrying out these aggressions on neighbors is a distraction, because I think that in a sense, despite everything that happened in December and January, by March and April, ironically, China was the first country to really emerge from the pandemic, and they've largely brought it under control at home. As skeptical as I think many people are, I think they have brought it under control at home since April. But I think that history tells us that these moments, I think it's an easy crutch for the leadership to, act out, to foment nationalism at home. And I think that it's as I argue in the book, I have an entire chapter on ideology and the role it plays in Chinese politics. And I think that the turn to nationalism under Xi Jinping is one of the big changes that's happened in China in the last 10 years. And I think we're only beginning to really feel the impact of this change.
And now that you have mentioned about the Beijing going into lockdown, I'm very curious to know about what were the correct stages and how did that take place in January when you were there?
No, it's quite interesting. I think the response to the pandemic is really, it's like, as you say in football, it's a game of two halves, where I think first was a really botched response. And I think that, as I outlined in the book as well, there were terrible mistakes made especially by the government in Wuhan and Hubei, the province in which Wuhan is located. There are strong suggestions that there was a cover-up for the very crucial 21 days from December 31st, which is when they really began to get a sense of what was happening. To be fair, cases were reported from early December, but I think you must remember this was a completely new virus. Doctors themselves were scrambling to figure out why they were getting this huge intake of pneumonia patients. But by December 30th, which is when the famous Chinese whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang sent a message on WeChat to his colleagues saying, we have a SARS-like situation. That was December 30th. And I think the period from December 30th to January 20th, when they actually declared nationally that they had a crisis, was a very crucial 21-day period where mistakes were made, I think mainly at the local provincial level, because I think the Chinese system, as I also talk about in the book, is geared in a way where provincial leaders kind of want to hide things, and they don't want the central government in Beijing to usually find out these things which will hurt their own careers and prospects. And usually it's a culture of trying to hide things until they become too big that you can no longer hide them. But having said that, I think that there is a lot to learn from how they locked down. So I was in Beijing when they locked down Wuhan and Hubei on Jan 23rd. So immediately in the place where I was living, the local, kind of like our resident welfare associations, all of these were mobilized. They immediately came door to door, told people stay at home, told people wear masks. This was January. And so there was, and everyone obeyed, in the sense that I think a lot of people in Beijing lived through SARS. So I think when you look at why not just China, but a lot of East Asian countries did well, it's because they lived through SARS, and they really had this, they internalized how to react to these emergency situations. And I saw that in Beijing. Nobody went out. Even though it was Chinese New Year, nobody went to people's houses. We were supposed to go to friends' houses. Everything was canceled. And so there's a huge public awareness. So now I think people are wondering, why is it that, you had thousands of cases in Wuhan and Hubei? Why didn't they spread to the rest of China? I think a big reason was because of this lockdown throughout January, February, and up to March. So essentially for 2.5, 3 months, you had a situation of the entire country coming to a complete standstill, and that being followed, implemented by harsh measures, which I think could not have been done in many other countries. But at the end of the day, it worked, which is why now they are completely back to normal, domestically at least, and they have almost no local transmissions at home.
That's fantastic. As a bystander and, somebody who's seen all of it unfold from the, just the confinement of my room, it's very interesting for me that, everybody around the world has responded to it in completely drastic ways, this virus, specifically when you compare America and India and China. Even Italy, of course. And I think I can't help but think that this difference comes from, of course, the cultural differences, how we react to situations generally. And that brings me to my next question. So, of course, we know that you have stayed in China for so long, and you've understood, you also speak Mandarin as well, which of course is needed since you're a journalist there. So how much did understanding their culture help you write this book? How much did, living there, understanding their point of view, help in sort of getting this book together?
I think that I don't quite know if I understand their culture after all these years, in the sense that, no, I think it's kind of like with any country, that if you live in a place, the more you kind of try and appreciate the complexities, where somebody's attitude will lead you to think in one direction, then you'll meet somebody else who completely confounds you. So I think the biggest lesson I took away from it was to try and be cognizant of the fact that you're talking about a really complicated place and culture, and to try and refrain from painting it in broad brush strokes, which is what I tried to do in the book by presenting as many voices as I could. But obviously, I think that that's why I think it's so important to have reporters on the ground there. I think being immersed in a place, I don't think you can report on a country unless you really live there, speak the language, and you're immersed there, which is why that I think it's a huge tragedy, as I keep coming back to in the book. Throughout 2020, when you had this tremendous crisis, this double crisis of COVID plus the boundary crisis, there were 2 Indian reporters in China, which is crazy, from the Press Trust of India and from Hindustan Times. So you had 2 Indian correspondents covering this country when there should be 20, 25, 30 reporters on the ground who know the place and telling us what's going on. And sometimes you wonder if you had dispatches coming in from January when the whole country locked down. I think a lot of the world was really not paying attention to some degree. Obviously, they covered up in December. But I think that when a country of 1.4 billion locks down in January, I think everybody else should be on panic mode. And in India, I came back on Jan 29th, and I did a self-imposed 14-day quarantine in Chennai. But I filled out a form at the airport. But during 14 days, I didn't get a single call from the local authorities in Chennai. No one came home and asked. I'd come from China, and nobody bothered to even follow up. And I think all of that happened only by end February, as far as I remember, when I had a friend who came back from the US. And I think the local authorities in Chennai were quite good in following up. But you had a span of 30 days when God knows how many people flew in. And by that point, the virus has gone to Europe and the Middle East. We had a huge number of people coming back from the Middle East. So that just goes to show that would we have been more aware of what was happening? You would hope that that would be the case. But I think that, to your question, it's so important to be immersed in a place. And that's why I think that I hope, as a country on every level, from the media to business, that we invest more in having people on the ground there, regardless how the relationship goes. By no means do I think this relationship is going to a good place. But all the more so, if the relationship is going to a bad place, you need to know the country even better. And I hope that we move in that direction and learn the lessons from 2020.
And it's very important to note that we are here talking about the first and the second most populous country in the world. So of course, there are so many complexities that we cannot just understand. Even, as you said, that even through all these years, it's not easy to understand all of the cultural differences and all of that. So, a lot of our audience are not people who generally very regularly follow political what is going on between China, but of course basic few grassroots things we all know. I think we know that there was the app ban, and we know the incident that took place at the border. So how, to somebody who does not follow so regularly, how would you explain your book? And could you tell us a little bit about how you wrote the book and structured it?
No, absolutely. So the first thing is I wanted to write a book for somebody who's not an expert, both in terms of the style of writing, the language, and the structure and the content. I think there are a lot of good China books, but I think sometimes they're written for the academic community or for experts. And so, for example, there are great books that are on the boundary, history of the boundary dispute, and all that, but they're so inaccessible to people the way they're written. So I kind of wanted to try and glean everything I could from the lot of great reporting that's there on China and from my own experience, but write it for a first-time reader. So that was my intent. And so I kind of outlined the book. I sort of prefaced the book by saying what it isn't, and the fact that it isn't really an academic book or an international relations book. I think it's more the perspective of a reporter and my experience living there for the last 9 years in terms of the political changes, economic changes, and the social changes. But it's also not a memoir. You don't find it full of my own personal experiences or my own personal views, rather. It's about, I think it's trying to present perspectives of people that I came to meet there, and you'll find a range of perspectives from dissidents to former Chinese boundary negotiators, to environmental activists, to people in the Chinese industry, to their tech giants. So you'll find to Indian businessmen in China. So I think you'll find a range of voices. And in the book, as Neeta said in her introduction, I identify 4 challenges. And the book is divided into 6 parts. And the first 4 parts deal with these 4 challenges, being the political challenge, which is explaining China's political system, the role of the Communist Party, the legacy of Mao, the rise of Xi Jinping, and what Xi Jinping has done to change China. That's part 1. In the second part, I look at the economic challenge of learning from the China model, the manufacturing success story, learning what to do, what not to do. I have 1 chapter on urbanization, how they urbanized, the move from rural China, how reforms began in rural China and then moved to the cities. Again, what to do, what not to do. And then I have 1 chapter on the rise of China as an innovating country and the rise of tech China, which is something people thought would never happen. The third part of the book looks at the diplomatic and military challenge, looks at China's diplomacy under Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road, as well as the bilateral relationship, the whole complexity of the bilateral relationship. And the fourth challenge, which is my personal favorite, is the history challenge, because I think it doesn't get so much attention. But I make the case that I think it's so important for us to understand the history of the boundary question, as well as the legacy of 1962, if we really want to move forward in the relationship. So I try and present for a lay reader the origins of the boundary dispute. So it's always going to be a tricky thing to write, but I try to be as objective as I can. The origins of the boundary dispute as both countries see it, the origins of the 62 war as both countries see it, and the lessons we can draw from that. And I think finally I end with a part on portraits, which is 6 different Chinese people in different walks of life that left an impression on me. And all of them had very unique links to India, including the captain of their women's cricket team, to somebody who runs a museum and uncovered the relics of Hindu temples in South China. So they have sort of profiles of 6 people that aim to try and present a little bit of the diversity of views that I came across when I'm there. To my surprise, I went to China with the impression that I wouldn't find such a diversity of views, but I think that was one of my big takeaways.
I think that is what is, the most interesting part of your book for me is the fact that you mentioned that you have taken so many perspectives. And, in one of our early interviews, one of the authors, I remember he told us that how, it's very important to believe in the fact that there is no one absolute truth. And for us to explore that, we need to have different perspectives and, go through. So I think it's absolutely necessary for everyone who's present to, for anyone who is wanting to understand the India-China challenge, they should definitely go and read your book.
Thanks.
And so it's just one small, if you could give us a little bit insight on how, when you I believe reached China in 2008 for the first time, and now in January you came back. So between this, what was a few major, atmospheric changes that you felt that were happening in terms of our relationship? Just 2008 and January 2020.
I think for me, the biggest change is broader than the India-China relationship, but obviously which impacts the India-China relationship is that I arrived at the time of the Olympics in Beijing, and the following year was a global financial crisis. And I think these two events were hugely important in terms of sort of reframing China's relations with the world. I arrived actually at a time of surprising openness in China. They just changed the rules for how foreign journalists could report, made it a lot easier for journalists to travel internally from province to province without permissions. The domestic media in China was opening up, even though party controlled. You were having great independent, as independent as they could be, publications come up. And it was really a time of openness. There were NGOs were coming up, and I was quite taken aback by this mood in China leading up to the leadership change in 2012, where among everyone that I knew, there seemed to be a feeling that they were moving in a direction of more openness politically. And I don't mean in terms of ending a one-party rule and having a full democracy, but within the framework of one-party rule, having some amount of political liberalization, whether in terms of the media or whether in terms of how the courts were functioning. So it felt like you were moving to something in 2012. But then you had this huge event with the rise of Xi Jinping in November 2012. And in the book, I talk about it as a hugely pivotal and transformative moment that brought this whole process to a screeching halt. And I think in many ways over the last 6-7 years, you had a regression of this limited opening up that I found, whether in my interactions with journalists or academics in China, or even activists in China. A lot of that has regressed in the last 7-8 years. So in many ways, the country that I left, unfortunately in 2018, I think it was in many ways far less open. And from my own day-to-day perspective of doing my job, it actually became so much harder as a journalist being in China in 2018 than it was in 2008, just in terms of the willingness of people to take a risk and talk to you. Now, I think the costs of doing so have become a lot higher under Xi Jinping, which is one unfortunate takeaway that I had when I left in 2018.
I think this is something that, this change really affected what happened in 2012, really affected our relations with, with China as well. And, going forward, how do you see, the relationship progressing? Because as of now, it's pretty bleak as the situation, the relationship. How do you think we could get out of this? Do you even think that China wants to try and solve this? Because from our perspective, it looks as if it's, not happening in the near future.
I would agree with you in the sense that obviously this was a problem of their own making, given that I think the relationship had reached a very stable place by the end of 2019. Everything I heard after Xi Jinping's visit to Chennai was good from both sides. And I think that it really caught everybody in Delhi by surprise when China took the decision, presumably sometime in April, to mobilize 2 divisions and try and redraw the line of actual control, essentially calling into question the founding principles of managing the boundary, essentially calling into question the basic sort of understanding both sides had that led to the normalization of the relationship in 1988. So I think that we may well be seeing a moment that's as significant as 1988, which is when Rajiv Gandhi went to China and the normalization process began, as well as this model of trying to shelve differences, including the boundary, and work on other areas. And even though it's easy to sort of look back and criticize it now, I think the model worked well for 30 years, because if you look at how trade has grown, if you look at the fact that both sides have broadly been peaceful and managed the boundary fairly well, I think that we all know that a shot hadn't been fired since 1975, which was broken in 2020. So I think that whole model is now called into question. We're now at a very interesting phase where we're looking for a new way to engage with China. I think that there's no going back the way I see it. I think that the compartmentalizing is gone. no longer are you going to have the situation where you're going to say, okay, let's welcome the Alibabas and Tencents and others to come and invest while we have a huge security problem. I think all that's gone. And I think you're seeing that in the way the government of India is reassessing its economic relations with China. And I think it's a logical thing for us to do because of the fact that the bedrock of the relationship has really been shaken this summer. So I don't see us going back. So I have a fairly pessimistic view of how things are going to go. So we have to wait and see, but it is an interesting time in the sense that I think we're going to find a new way. I think the External Affairs Minister put it really well in his book, which is something I recommend reading, where he says, I think it's about finding a new equilibrium. I think that really captures it, because it's not going to be, I don't think neither side wants this to be a relationship that's going to be into outright hostility and confrontation and war. Neither side wants it. I don't think it's ever going to be a relationship where we see eye to eye on everything. So I think the best thing we can do is find a way to live with each other. And I think he put it really well in terms of finding a new equilibrium, but I think it's going to be a difficult process.
Yes, yes. I think more than pessimistic, I think this is practical, this is a fact.
Yeah.
It's a realistic way forward, and this is how it is going as of now. So I think with this, we can start a little bit with the interactive session. There are a lot of people wanting to ask you quite a few questions, and I think we can start with the first one.
It was a great insight. We loved hearing about the book, and I'm sure many of us who have not read the book will immediately order the book on Amazon and go through it. It's a very, very different perspective, I must say. Major General Gagandeep Bakshi, he needs no introduction. He's in fact probably India's most famous thinking and talking military veteran and author of several well-established
of factors. And I think the thing that concerns me most is when they are in these periods of insecurity, as you rightly put it, when they feel hemmed in, it often manifests itself in this exact same way that we're seeing, whether it's with India or with Taiwan or with the South China Sea. And I think over the next 2 years, when the next leadership congress happens in 2022, and Xi Jinping finishes 10 years at the helm and possibly gives us an inkling of who's going to succeed him or not, I think over the next 2 years, I would expect this trend to continue. I don't think my crystal ball can see beyond that, but I think the next 2 years and the two big anniversaries of the party turning 100 years old in 2021 and the Congress in 2022, I think I would expect this phase to continue, which is I think a concerning thing for countries on China's periphery.
Can I just ask one more question? And that is because you have been there. I mean, you are our boots on the ground, and there are very few boots, as you very rightly pointed out. There has to be a lot more of our press out there. Unfortunately, it's not. There is a speculation that COVID-19 was a deliberate biological warfare strike, Pearl Harbor, if you will. And the way the Chinese PLA has been acting aggressive, people are speculating that they had foreknowledge of what was coming, and it is like virtually exploiting in the wake of a biological warfare strike. And it's not all that hypothetical. If you read Chinese military literature, their strategic literature, they have been talking of weaponizing the biological virus, right? Dr. Xi Zhengli, she wrote 4 papers on weaponizing this virus, adding the SARS hook molecule onto the bat coronavirus. 89 species of bat coronavirus had been studied with the Americans in this thing. Now, the Wuhan wet market, from where they are saying it's a natural outbreak, I'm told has no bats sold there. And this has come from the bats, right? It is a bat coronavirus. It's a novel bat coronavirus. And those bats nearest are found around Nanjing, the sledgehammer bats, the huge from which this has come. They have taken they had purchased the which is an antidote to this before this virus started. How is it that, New York, 12,000 kilometers away, was affected, Italy, Europe, and India were affected, but Beijing and Shanghai, 1,800 kilometers respectively, remained absolutely safe? You think there is some truth or there is some credibility to the conjecture that this was made in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that it leaked either accidentally or deliberately? Can I have your views, because you were there on the ground?
Yeah, so I think that obviously, I think the virologists know best, the people who studied the virus. And from what I have read, I think the consensus seems to be that the virus, in terms of its structure, from at least what I understand, what American virologists are saying, is that it was something that was naturally occurring because of the fact that it was very similar to what they found elsewhere. And the only reason why I think that they were not prepared is that even though it seems a long time ago, we still don't know how bad the situation was in Wuhan. And from my own recollection of what happened in December and January, and I highly recommend to you all the diary, Wuhan Diary by Fang Fang, who wrote a first-hand account, which is now out in English, of living through the chaos of the first month. So I think they were quite overwhelmed in Wuhan, and it doesn't seem to me that they were well prepared in advance. But saying that the virus is natural obviously doesn't answer the question of where it came from, whether it was something that they were studying, whether it was something they were studying and got out from the lab. Frankly, we don't know either way. I think the two realistic scenarios, whether it was something they were studying and it got out, it still doesn't mean it was a created virus. That is something we don't know. That will only be answered if they find an intermediate, as they did with SARS-1, where it was a civet cat. So here again, from what I've understood from American virologists, they think it jumped from an intermediate, whether it was a pangolin or some other animal. And I think until they conclusively find out what the intermediate was, I think these speculations and theories will go around. But my own sort of views on this, if I had two views on this, the first is that from the bumbling reaction that they had in Wuhan, and the fact that a lot of interviews I've read with Chinese doctors in Wuhan hospitals who were really caught unawares and were trying to figure out what this thing was, to me, it seemed like it was something that they were not prepared for. And the second thing, in terms of how the rest of China handled it, which is a question I get asked a lot, was there some miracle secret drug that they had? That I think the answer is quite simple. And it's something that you saw in a lot of East Asian countries, which is Wuhan. By the time Wuhan locked down, about 5 million people had left Wuhan, of which I think 90% went internally within China, 10% went overseas. And obviously the overseas impact was far greater than the domestic impact. And I think that my own guess would be that there were cases in these cities. They undercounted them, so don't really go by the numbers at face value. There were certainly cases in cities outside of Wuhan and Hubei, including Beijing and Shanghai. There were cases. So the Chinese official numbers are to be taken with a few grains of salt. But I think that even though there were official cases, there were outbreaks in these cities. I think they were able to contain them only because of a very aggressive 3-month lockdown, which was far different from the lockdown that I experienced in India, in Chennai. It was a real aggressive lockdown where people literally couldn't leave their homes. You had a designated family member who was allowed to go once a week to buy groceries, and that's it. It's not that anybody could step out of their homes. The homes and residential communities were being policed by volunteers. So I think that the lockdown for 2-3 months is the real reason. The fact that they locked down very well, they are an excellent contact tracing program. I think we were quite overwhelmed by April and May. I don't think, where I am in Chennai, frankly, there's been very poor contact tracing. We've always been behind the virus. But I think what China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea did to a large degree was lockdown, trace, test, and that's how they did it. I don't think there was any sort of magic bullet. So that's my reading of it anyway.
I think Sir's video is paused because of the internet issue.
Ananth has in any case answered his question. Thank you. Are you back with us?
No, I think his video is...
But thank you, Major General Bakshi. It was indeed a pleasure having you back with us. In fact, Ananth, he was one of our guests for one of our author interaction series, and we discussed the book, Bose or Gandhi. Next, we have Sandeep Unithan.
Hello.
Yes, sir, you're back. Can you hear us?
I think...
yeah, you can. Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. Yeah. I'd like to welcome Sandeep Onathan now. He's the executive editor India Today and author of Operation X and Black Tornado. And really, thank you once again, Sandeep, for connecting Ananth with us. Yeah.
Thank you, Neeta. It's always a pleasure to meet Ananth, whether in person or virtually. Ananth, congratulations for this great book. And I want to dive to my question right away. Chapter 10 is when you're talking about Doklam and Galwan, from Doklam to Galwan. At the end of one of the ninth chapter, you speak about this Western Theater commander. The Western Theater Command comes out with a statement which says that the aim at Doklam was to get India to capitulate without fighting. So it kind of reminded me of this line from the Bruce Lee film Enter the Dragon, the art of fighting without fighting. Now, that's something that we've seen in Ladakh as well. The kind of mobilization that we've seen, the pattern of mobilization from people who've studied it, seem to suggest it's more of belligerent war avoidance is what they've called it, rather than actual, military intent to move across the border. How much of this is part of Chinese military thinking? I mean, have you seen this in other conflicts, in other standoffs as well? This other than war situation, this posturing without actually resorting to military operations.
Thanks so much, Sandeep, and good to see you. We were in the same office, as for those of you who don't know, and we did a lot of stories together. Sandeep obviously is, I think, one of India's best defense reporters by a mile, and he's been reporting on India's defense issues for a really long time, and he's someone I always turn to for advice and wisdom. And he and I collaborated on a lot of stories for India Today, especially during the Doklam crisis, and I quote him in the book as well. But I think that it's a really good question, and you're absolutely right that is the intent. And I think that perhaps the clearest example of that has been how they've dealt with the South China Sea, in terms of, it's quite remarkable the way in which they've changed the status quo in the South China Sea without a bullet being fired. And countries have been able to do very little about it. This has been through the so-called sort of construction of islands, which they have subsequently militarized in many different ways. And they have literally changed the facts on the ground without firing a shot and avoiding conflict. I think that has been in the intent along the boundary as well. That was exactly what was happening in Doklam, as well as I, in terms of the way they were carrying out construction and trying to effectively unilaterally change the situation on the ground. And I think they were taken aback by the fact that India stepped in and did embarrass them to some degree. And there were questions being asked in China back then. And I think we're seeing that elsewhere on the line of actual control now with what they've done, starting in Galwan Valley, which was to push up to their own perception of the LAC just overnight, literally doing it overnight, even though there's been a system in place since 1993 and even beyond, where we both recognized mutual differences of alignment. And we came up with the pattern to regulate behavior within these differences of alignment. But overnight that changed. I think they were taken aback to some degree by India's response. I don't think, as you rightly said, I think it was a case of trying to mobilize and change the facts on the ground without conflict. And I don't think, from my own views, I don't think what happened on the night of June 15th was something that was planned in the sense of having casualties. I think that they were, if you go back to it, obviously, as well as I do, it happened during the process of enforcing disengagement. Both were in talks. And it seemed to me that the Chinese game was continuing talks with India on the one hand, while on the other, not really disengaging and actually beefing up the position on the ground. So the entire incident on June 15th, as you have reported as well, happened over a difference in Chinese refusal to agree to what was agreed in the talks, which is something that's still going on after God knows how many months. I think that is absolutely the intent. And the big challenge now India faces is, how do you respond to this? Because neither side wants to go up the escalation ladder. I think what India did in the end of August is one possible way out of this, which is to do the exact same thing. So at least now we have something to bargain with. And it seems to me that how we go out of this, it seems to be three possibilities. I think now that actually India has something to bargain with as well, given that we have occupied all those heights south of Pangong Lake, it's now a question of who moves from where and when. I think best case scenario, they agree something at the next few rounds of talks, but I would agree with your assessment, which I highly recommend to everyone. Sandeep has done a fantastic story on how both sides are preparing for winter and winter stocking, which leads me to think this could be a long haul. And I think the third would be a worst case scenario where you have an unintended escalation as happened on June 15th. It could go either way, but I think probably we're in it for the long haul.
Thanks, Ananth.
Thank you, Sandeep. In fact, Ananth, he was with us for 13th author interaction, and we discussed both the books, and it was a very fondly remembered episode that we had. Next, we have Sandeep Bhargava. Thank you, Sandeep. Next, we have Sandeep Bhargava. He's a telecom professional and management consultant in corporate affairs and public policy. Sandeep, please.
Thank you, Neeta, and thank you, Ananth, for a very well described book of yours and your experiences in China. Being a telecom veteran, my question to you is on the telecom lines. Now, currently, few companies of China are literally banned in India. They are not allowed to operate, but they have a legacy of networks still working in India. What do you think, and what do you foresee that our relationship would be, so that we don't get harmed by the networks which are already there? Because Chinese are known for their own way of working by putting the networks in place. What do you foresee that will we improve on those relations from a technology perspective, or will ultimately throw them out of this country, their technology, which is already engrossed in many of the telecom operators? What's your view here?
I think that is a great question. You're probably better placed to know the technical answers to this than I am, but I will venture a guess based on my own reporting of trying to figure the same thing out. My limited understanding is obviously, I think Chinese equipment is a huge presence in our 3G and 4G networks. And I think that Indian regulators are somewhat assured that there is little or no security threat from the equipment that's already here and in place, because it's equipment and not managing the network. I think the reason why I think this cooperation is not going to go to 5G, is precisely because of the fact that I think regulators are concerned that the way in which 5G works is completely different. And it is going to be very, very difficult for India to allow Chinese operators in the way in which they are already present in several countries and essentially running their 5G networks. And obviously, it's completely understandable why India can't take that step, given the very unique security relationship we have with China. The way I look at it, I think that there certainly is going to be an attempt to reassess our trade and investment relations with China. But I don't think it's going to be a complete ban of doing all kinds of business with China. I think that if you look at the structure of trade, fortunately or unfortunately, the reality is for the next few years at least, we are going to continue importing large amounts of goods from China in various sectors. That's not going to change. Whether it's APIs for a pharma industry, or whether it's electrical machinery, or whether it's even power equipment, I think that isn't going to change because of the fact that Indian companies feel that it's in their economic interest to do that. I think that Chinese mobile phone sales are an interesting indicator. I just saw numbers 2 days ago that said that in the quarter that just ended, Chinese mobile phone, the smartphone share of Chinese companies in 2020 was 76%, up from 74% in 2019, which shows that even consumer behavior seems to be impacted in a limited way by political events. So I think that it's going to be a mixed picture where we're going to be much more vigilant in scrutinizing Chinese investments, as the changes in FDI policy already tell us. I don't think it's going to be as open as it was in the past. I think that deals that happened already, such as Alibaba being a major shareholder in Paytm, or Tencent being major shareholders in several Indian startups, I think those kind of deals are going to be very hard to take place going forward. Even though for the Indian startup sector, I think Chinese capital is very easy capital. So I think we're going to be more vigilant in allowing Chinese companies to come in, but I think we'll still be a major importer for some time to come.
So that agreed. Thank you for that. But the biggest worry is the telco networks still have the Chinese equipment embedded already over the past few years, including the BSNL. How does the government would like to take care of that? Because always Chinese networks have been seen with suspicion, inverted commas, always with suspect. US has banned them across the country. Many other countries have taken steps. How do we take care of the networks which are already existing? That's the worrisome
Yeah,
part.
a few months ago, I did spend some time with somebody from IIT who was sort of working with the Indian government on 5G policy. And so he spent a day unsuccessfully trying to get me to understand how all of this works. But the limited takeaway that I had from him was that he said that from their understanding, they did not find any backdoors in 3G and 4G, and there had been no evidence till date that so far there hasn't been any evidence that the equipment we've used in 3G and 4G networks has been tampered with. There has been no evidence to suggest that, but they were less comfortable with opening up 5G because of our own limited ability to police equipment in a 5G network. Hence, we are likely to be much more cautious. Was my limited takeaway from my interaction with them.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now we have Major General Sudhir Dutt. Uncle Dutt, he retired in 1996 as Major General, and now he's running his manpower and security company. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ananth, I am really impressed with the way you have written a book. I want to know your insight about Tibet, because for us, as army personnel, we feel that if we could create a revolution in Tibet, we could create a major problem for China. Do you think it is possible?
Thank you for your question. In the book, I do have a chapter on Tibet, which has been, for me, I think Tibet and Xinjiang were, for me, two almost obsessions when I was in China for the last 8-9 years. I tried to travel as much as I could. The problem of traveling to what we call Tibet Autonomous Region, or what the Chinese call Tibet Autonomous Region, is that as a foreign journalist, you can't travel there without a permit. So I only went to Lhasa once in 2015 at the time of the opening of the Nathula route. But I did travel quite a lot I think a lot of us aren't really aware of the fact that only half of China's Tibetan population lives in the area that we commonly think of as Tibet, which is the Tibet Autonomous Region. The other half, there are 3 million people who live in 4 provinces that border Tibet, which are Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan. So I did multiple trips to Tibetan areas in these 4 provinces, especially in 2012, when you had more than close to 200 self-immolations, self-immolation protests. And my takeaway would be that I think there obviously are a lot of issues that I think Tibetans are facing. I think that China's ethnic minority policy has really changed since about in the last 10 years, where I think previously the idea of recognizing limited autonomy for the 55 official minority groups of China, I think there's been a hardline move because of the fact that the Communist Party is coming to the view that giving these minorities their so-called limited autonomy was engendering, a move away from following the party, and was leading to events such as the 2008 protests in Tibet and the 2009 riots in Xinjiang. In the book, I focus on both of these events and look at how the 2008 protests in Tibet and the 2009 riots in Xinjiang really were turning points in leading to greater securitization of both those places. And I think that the result of that is there's a lot less autonomy than there was in the past. And in the past, obviously, it was still limited. There's a huge change, for example, in language policy, where Tibetan is being taught much less now. They are trying to, even the Chinese government has officially said they're trying to sinicize people in minority areas. The result of which is, I think, that the party has much firmer control, as I see it, even though there may be grievances among the local population. From my own understanding, it does seem to be a really securitized state in Tibet and Xinjiang. So from my own point of view, I think the scope to challenge the Communist Party's control is quite limited. It seems to be very firmly in their grasp, even though I think there are a lot of local level issues. I think for the near future, I expect this securitization-based approach to continue in both places. In Xinjiang, obviously, it has ended up in this extreme situation where you've had a network of internment camps being built. and I think they have housed at their peak 1 million people, 1 million Uyghurs, which is about 10% of the entire Uyghur population, has been in an internment camp, which is something that you or I would never have thought possible in the year 2020, but there you are. So I think that it's going to continue in this direction of securitization, but a result of that is, I think, they're in quite firm control because of the fact that they have deployed so much resources in both these places.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunil, Uncle. Yes. Now we have Neeraj Jain. He's engaged in the business of providing investment advice. Maybe, Shreya, we can take up Mr. Atul. Mr. Atul, in fact, he's the member of IIM Shillong Board of Governors. Yes, Atulji. Atulji, your question.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, hi. Good evening. I mean, it's a wonderful, question of not experiences, but also what you see going forward to happen till 2022 at least. After 2022, we don't know what is going to be, what is there in the offing. But I mean, my question is, I mean, the whole world is like, because I work in some of these smaller geographies in the world, and they try to play one against the other. I mean, whether it is the small island nations or the Central Asian countries where 1+17, 1+18 is being actively pursued, and so on and so forth. But having seen some of the outcomes of the smaller nations, do you think there is any kind of rethinking in China about this whole idea of kind of, if I may use the word, colonizing in the new era some of these smaller geographies? Do you think there is some kind of rethinking that is going on there?
You know, I think that the Belt and Road Initiative is something that I think really encapsulates the way in which I think China sees its relationship with the rest of the world. I think if you look at, say, Central Asia and Southeast Asia as two examples where obviously you're dealing, especially in South Asia, where you're dealing with a couple of countries that obviously are far smaller economies, but for better or for worse are in China's economic orbit. I think that the Chinese thinking is that economic interdependence, in their view, is something that gives them some amount of assurance. They're obviously their number one abiding, overwhelming strategic priority that they're obsessed with is the US. It's not India, it's not Japan, it's not anybody else. And I think they've obviously been concerned by the fact that a lot of countries in their periphery have still turned to the US for whether it's defense and security ties, while being in China's economic orbit. So you've had this very strange situation in many countries in China's neighborhood where China is the biggest trading partner, the biggest source of investment, but many of them still are very close partners of the US. I think they've looked at economic interdependence as one way to hedge. And that's why I think that's been one underlying logic for the Belt and Road Initiative, was the thinking that if these countries are going to be economically dependent on China, it is a way for them to have very important leverage there. I don't see that changing. But there has been some rethink to your question, at least from the limited point of view of the fact that I think in the initial phase of the Belt and Road, they did not quite expect the pushback that they faced in many countries where there were domestic concerns. So I spent some time looking at Malaysia and Sri Lanka as a visiting fellow in Hong Kong University. I did a project looking at how anxieties about Chinese economic interdependence were influencing domestic politics in some of these countries. And so there has been a pushback, and I think they're trying to react to that and be more sensitive, since I think they went ahead a bit too aggressively, at least the first phase of the BRI, which led to pushback. It led to governments being voted out in many countries. So from where I see it, there has been a tinkering for two reasons. One is because of this pushback, and the second is even internally in China. there has been a little bit of concern that they're making investments that aren't yielding returns. But how far this goes, I think we're still in the early stages of this so-called Belt and Road 2.0. But it does seem to me that they are cognizant to these concerns that you mentioned, if that helps.
And do you see China really making an attempt to take the space which to an extent, I won't say big way, but to an extent, US is vacating in the East Asia?
I think it's
West Asia.
so. Sorry, you mean in West Asia? Or?
West Asia, not East Asia, West Asia.
I don't think so, because I think so far they've been extremely cautious where in all of these countries where they see a vacuum, they're going in economically, but not militarily. And I think they're very aware of their own limitations. I don't think they have any appetite to have boots on the ground in any of those countries, including Afghanistan. What they want to do is they want these countries they're obviously happy to have an American withdrawal, but their ideal scenario is to have China-friendly governments that are in charge of their own security, that give China a large chunk of the economic pies. I think that's their game. And I don't think they want to really replace the US in having boots on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have Ajay Abrol. He's from the Federation of Buying Agencies. Ajay, your question, please.
Yeah, hello, Mr. Krishnan. It's a pleasure to meet you and an opportunity to talk to you about China. China holds a very close competition with us on very different fields. We are into exports mostly. And yes, we follow or we watch closely into what China is doing and how they're doing. Taking forward on where Mr. Atul Kulkarni was asking you about the OBR, something that we are equally concerned about. Do you think that the OBR will open additional doors for China to reach Middle East? And does it bring in closer to the Ukraine and Turkey? And will it open another door for them to make sales cheaper, goods cheaper, and through Turkey into the Europe? What do you think? Your opinion.
Thank you, Ajay. It's a good question. And I do have a chapter on the book on the BRI, and I traveled to Xi'an, which is where they launched the China-Europe train. And it was quite interesting to speak to the people who run the train, that there are 4 or 5 different routes that go from Xi'an and end up in Germany. But the interesting thing is that trains were going full and coming back almost empty. The trains were going with all sorts of things from low-end stuff, from toys to high-end equipment. They were just coming back with hardly anything. They were coming back with sunflower seeds that the Chinese like to buy from Eastern Europe as a snack. So it is, I think, opening up new markets for them, for their companies that are dealing with, excess capacity at home. It's a logical outcome for them to access these markets. But I think at the same time, the people who are running this train were very cognizant of the fact that there's domestic politics in each of these countries, where each of these countries, people are sensitive to the fact that you're buying lots of stuff from China and you're having a lopsided relationship and you're not selling anything to them. In some of these countries, you have the Chinese coming in and buying ports and getting access to infrastructure in these countries. So it's a very tricky balancing act for them on how they're obviously having this outward push, but it's also about managing this outward push and this access to new markets while trying to keep in place the sensitivities of the local population, which they aren't really figured out as yet. So I think that the mood in Europe is quite interesting, especially post-COVID. I think recent surveys that I have seen show that sentiment towards China is at an all-time low in the West. So I don't know how this is going to go forward. Has the BRI peaked? I think we have to wait and see. Our country is going to become more averse to it. But at the same time, economics is a strange thing. Even though people were so upset about COVID-19, where did they turn to for medical supplies? And where did they turn to for PPE kits? And where did they turn to for ventilators? In Europe, many countries turn to China. So there you go.
I understand. I get your point on that one. I have one more question to ask you. What do you think about the average Chinaman? Does he have a better buying capacity now from what he was 5 years back, 10 years back? Does he have access to a lot more of American international television channels? I mean, is Netflix as popular out there as in India? What are the, I'm trying to see that, when we talk about within India, what drove the economy was that we had an understanding of what is selling in America or what is selling in the West, and we wanted to follow or emulate that and bring it into India and adapt those cultures, adapt those ways of living and standard of living. So is there a demand being created? Do you see that happening? Because if that happens, then I don't need to worry about China going outside, because they will be more concerned about feeding themselves and taking care of themselves, their internal economy in that sense. Do you see that?
It's a great question, and I will answer it in looking at three different things which are slightly different. I think your question looked at consumer behavior, cultural views, and political views, which are all slightly different, and I'll try and answer it slightly differently with each three. If you look at consumer behavior, I think you're absolutely right. I think over the last 10 years, it's just the way domestic consumption has grown, it's just phenomenal. And I think that for all the skepticism, they are rebalancing the economy. Even if domestic consumption, I think now maybe 45–50% of growth is still something much bigger than in the past. And I think that, 2 days ago, I was just following on Alibaba's very popular Taobao app. November 11th is the biggest shopping day in all of China. It's called Singles Day. And if you just Google this, if you look at the daily sales of Taobao on November 11th, it is something like 10 times India's entire annual e-commerce sales is what Alibaba does in one day on November 11th. And they've already started promoting this November 11th. And I was watching, just sort of curiosity, there's one really famous Chinese salesperson. His name is Li Jiaqi. He was a guy that was selling lipsticks and cosmetics in a shopping mall in a godforsaken place somewhere in South China. He became really popular because of live streaming. And now he is a millionaire who is sort of selling luxury brands. He has tie-ups with Chanel, Dior, everybody who pay to have their things advertised on his live streaming show. 2 nights ago on his channel on Alibaba's live streaming app, I found that there were 100 million viewers, which is ridiculous, which is 100 million viewers. And so he would offer like a Dior product, and so people would have literally 10 seconds to sell it. You would have, say, 1,000 items, and they were all being sold out in seconds. So I think consumer spending is just remarkable in China, which is why I think a lot of Western companies, luxury goods especially, are going to them. Culturally, I think you're also right, where they do have access to, for example, they don't use Netflix, but what they do is they have their own live streaming. They have their own video platforms that stream US shows, obviously with censorship. So obviously a show that has an overtly China plot isn't going to be seen, but something like House of Cards was hugely popular all of China. In fact, even their vice president said that he was watching House of Cards. So I think obviously this cultural influences they are exposed to. All the shows that young people in India watch, the American shows that young people in India watch, they watch as well with subtitles. But I would bring in a qualifier with the third part, which is politically. So all of this is very limited in these interactions. Cultural interactions are mediated very carefully by the Communist Party to ensure that even if the Chinese public is open to these American values in some limited ways, not so in others. I think in university classrooms, they're extremely sensitive to people being exposed to Western political ideas. I think the entire curriculum, as well as the entire media in China, is geared towards very carefully drumming home the message that China's political system is non-negotiable. It is something that, in their view, is unique to China, and they're very careful about people discussing, for example, the merits and the pros and cons of, say, Western-style democracy ever working in China. So I'd say consumer-wise and culturally, they're open, but when it comes to political values, I think they're very, very careful about limiting, restricting, and mediating it. I hope that was a long answer to your question, but it was a good question.
Well, I like that answer. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking time to do that.
Ananth, we just have one more question. I know we have overshot the time limit, but everyone has been wanting to interact with you. And Mr. Brian Lobo, he's there next. And in fact, he's read your book. He finished it only in the afternoon today. So I have to give him this chance of talking to you. Brian, please. And his internet has been really playing crazy since the beginning of the program. Brian, are you there?
Can you hear us?
No, I think he sent me his question also, so I'll like to read it. China's rise is anything but peaceful. China's security culture has made it I don't know, for supreme power, treating all others as barbarians. This was the theme of Middle Kingdom, and the same mindset continues. I think there was some mistake in writing. Could you get it, Ananth?
So sorry, if you could just, I understood the observation he made, but is the question that are those views the same, or?
I think, yes, I think that might be the question.
You know, I think that I would put limited stock in, I think obviously in China, as in India, as in any other country, there is obviously a history of views that shapes cultural perspectives that carry on. But at the same time, I am generally of the view that is a bit skeptical in drawing a very neat straight line from what was Chinese thinking 3,000, 2,000 years ago and Chinese thinking today. I think as with India, obviously, we like to think that there is a continuity in thought, but the reality, I think, is a bit more messy and I think a bit more complicated. For example, even in, I think sometimes in writings, too much is being made of, say, the tributary system, for example, and the fact that they're trying to recreate a tributary system today, which is something I'm skeptical about. I think that if you look at the Chinese state, it is only created in 1949. I think that even though the communist leadership is trying to draw continuity with, as they love to say, 5,000 years of civilization, I think the reality is much more complicated. You had, even in China's, modern China's own history, you had something like the Cultural Revolution, where you had a 10-year period that was trying to abrogate all traditional ideas and values. I'd say that when trying to get a sense of how Chinese history and strategic thought and their view of China's place in the world is prevalent today, I would say the best way to think about it is to look at India and look at the fact that how in many ways we continue to be shaped by our history, but we still evolve and adapt it to our own modern context. I think that's the same thing that's happening in China as well. So I'd say, so in short, my answer would be a mixed picture. Yes, in some ways they are colored by the fact that they are inheritors of this big civilization, like we do feel as well, which and they are colored by the fact that they feel they are a unique civilization state, again, as we do as well. But at the same time, I think they are cognizant of the fact that it's a very different world from what the Tang dynasty or the Qing dynasty lived in. So I would say it's an evolving view.
I had a second question, but I think it's not come on the chat. Sorry, Brian, I think your internet really was not working today. So thank you so much, Ananth, for the great opportunity to host you on our platform. It is indeed a pleasure and privilege to host you today. And it's been such a wonderful conversation, and you've given so many inputs, and we are so much richer, and we know so much about China now, thanks to you.
Thank you so much, Neeta and Shreya. It was a pleasure to talk to you both. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Sandeep as well for the introduction and helping us put this together.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's joined in.
I have to declare the winners also, Shreya.
Yes,
in fact, thanks to HarperCollins, they were really helpful, and they sponsored 3 books today. You have to sign them, and they'll be sent to us by HarperCollins. In fact, the 3 winners have been chosen by us because of their consistent and very valuable support that they have given us always, right from the beginning of these author interaction. And it seemed very appropriate that they get your book, because it's a very relevant book, very of today's time, and they should read it. One is Mr. Atul Kulkarni. In fact, he's been really instrumental in supporting our cause right from the day one. And second is Mrs. S. Sehgal. In fact, she's always been there for all our author interactions. She's been always the first one to connect. So she gets your second book. And third is Mr. Sharad Bhasin. In fact, thank you, Mr. Sharad, for being there always. And I think congratulations to them to get such a wonderful book. They would enjoy, and it's such a relatable and such an easy read and very good narrative. I have read the book and I loved it to the core. Yeah, thank you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. And hope to see you in better times. And we will be really glad if you could make it maybe in a few months for a physical event. We are wishing for that. Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining in today.
Thank you so much
to Vikas for the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.